Levin had positioned his men carefully, trying to remember all the textbook rules and training exercises. He gnawed off another mouthful of ham and thought of Yelena, his wife, and of their child, Mikhail. Fatherhood seemed to have shocked him awake. Now, when he spoke at political education seminars, the word future resonated with a deeper meaning, a better future, a better world, the world in which his son would live. But Yelena had changed after the child came. She demanded that he leave the army. She had an affair with a moronic line officer. Now, far away, she wrote decent, even loving letters, and sent him snapshots of his son. He tried not to think of the other men with whom she might be betraying him.
Comrade political officer.
It was Dunyaev, a lieutenant from the 3rd Company.
The battalion commander has sent me to relieve you. He wants you to report to him at the hospital.
Inside the hospital, Levin found Gordonov sitting by the bedside of a dying officer.
Anureev's badly wounded. Shot by his own shitty little buggers in the dark.
Anureev's a good officer, Comrade Battalion Commander.
I'm sorry. Was a good officer. He's meat for the worms now, but that's what soldiering is about, too.
He will have died for a noble cause. Gordonov shook his head. He didn't know what to make of Levin.
Anyway, I'm putting you in command of the entire Eastern Bank. You need to get down to Anureev's positions and have a quick look around. No matter what happens, remember that the primary mission is to retain the Northern Bridge. But that doesn't mean giving up the Southern Bridge without a fight.
I understand, Comrade Commander.
I hope you do. We'll split the command post. Be ready to assist me or to wait the fight at the most threatened point.
A plan began to form in Levin's mind. Comrade Commander, if I am to control this bank, I request permission to move your remaining battalion command elements out of the hospital. If you're going across the river, let me move everyone down to a central location. I can't protect them adequately here.
You have a site in mind?
The old town hall. There's good elevation for the radio sets, and it's well constructed. We can leave the light anti-tank elements here to cover the northern approaches and the bridge.
That sounds logical enough. You have the makings of a good soldier, Levin. You're different from me, perhaps a better sort. Who knows?
Gordonov said with an odd bitterness.
I moved the damned command post, but do it quickly, and, good luck.
Major Bezarin wanted to move. Propped up in the commander's hatch of his tank, he focused on the dark rear end of the tank ahead. His resentment had turned to anger as the hours passed. The regiment's chief of staff had halted the column without warning, telling Bezarin simply to close up and await further orders. Senior Lieutenant Roshin, Bezarin's youngest and least experienced commander, vaulted up onto the deck of Bezarin's tank. The boy reminded him of a spaniel.
Comrade Commander, any word?
Nothing.
The war must be going well.
Of course it's going well.
I wish I could have a cigarette. One smoke.
When it's light.
Do you think we'll be able to send letters soon?
Anna, thought Bezarin, and the letters unwritten, the words unsaid.
I've written 4 already, said Roshin. Natalia loves to get letters.
Bezarin wanted to ask Roshin how on earth he had time to write love letters. It suddenly occurred to him that this boy might not be alive for more than a few hours.
I suppose that you miss her. How could I not miss her? Really, you should marry, Comrade Commander.
Advice from this naive lieutenant was almost too much for Bezarin to bear, but he let it roll off. You should get a little sleep. I don't want you exhausted. We'll get into the fight today.
Do you really think so?
I'm sure of it, and I want you at your best. The radio squawked. The regiment's commander passed a brevity code. His message, movement in 10 minutes. Bezarin shouted at his own crew to get their gear on and start up the tank. The regiment's route led them through the wreckage of earlier fighting. There were plenty of ruined British vehicles in evidence. The British had died mostly in defensive positions, yet the Soviet losses were obviously greater. The last of the morning ground fog clung to the wood lines. Bezarin could already hear aircraft above, but there was no way of telling whose they were. The march column moved swiftly, yet Bezarin wanted them to go faster. The route passed a battered village. The haze continued to thin. A scout car emerged from the village and pulled up beside the command tank. A sergeant shouted to Bazarin that he was to report to the regimental commander in the town square. At last, thought Bazarin. In the town, he spotted a group of officers working over a map spread on the hood of a range car. Lieutenant Colonel Tarashvili looked up and smiled. He was a dark, handsome Georgian with a rich mustache and a beautiful southern wife. Well, Comrade Major Bazarin has arrived. Now everyone's here. Pay attention. There's very little time. Tarashvili explained that the British defenses had been ruptured during the night. Soviet units were already fighting on the outskirts of Hanover, but confusion within movement control had allowed the British time to patch together one last defense. Division stresses that no one is to stop, said Tarashvili. The intention is to reach the line of Highway 1, then advance west. Whoever achieves the first breakthrough becomes the forward detachment. He pointed to the map. Upon reaching this area, the forward detachment turns for Bad Oeynhausen, which is the objective of the day. Bazarin evaluated the mission. It was a long way to Bad Oeynhausen. The crossing site at Hamelin is considerably closer, he observed. Are there any provisions for seizing it? Tarashvili looked at him in annoyance, eyes nervous. It was evident that the Georgian was not up to the task of wartime command. A division has specifically identified Bad Oeynhausen as being of primary importance. We're obviously prohibited from moving on the Hamelin crossing site. You can see the control measures on the map. They are self-explanatory. Tarashvili dismissed everyone, forcing a smile. Bazarin turned to leave with the others, but Tarashvili caught him by the sleeve, aware that Bazarin recognized the extent of his superior's failure. What do you expect? He asked. What do you really expect, my friend? Bazarin did not know how to respond. Tarashvili reached into his officer's pouch. Smiling, he produced 2 chocolate bars. Here, spoils of war. The West Germans make wonderful chocolate, you know. Take them. Take them. You'll be glad of it later. The gift startled Bazarin. He took the bars, forcing out a word of thanks. The poor bastard's trying to bribe me with chocolate, he thought. So this is what war is really like. Bazarin led his column through the cluttered rear of the combat area. Now, speeding along the road from village to village, he felt as though nothing could stop him. Closer to the direct fire battle, artillery reconnaissance groups marked off and surveyed still more firing positions. Suddenly, the artillery began to fire. It was hard to believe that anything could survive such a barrage. Bazarin knew that the lead battalion was already in its start position, waiting for him to come up on the left. Hurriedly, Bazarin unrolled his signal flags and stood erect in the turret. He led the center company off the road, watching Dagliev hurry to catch up on the left. Roshin was on the right, on his own now. He appeared to be in control. The long line of tanks approached the dirty gray wall of the smoke screen. As his tank crested a low ridge, Bazarin saw that the 1st Battalion had begun to pull hard to the right. Then he saw the cause of the problem. A wind gap was opening in the smoke screen up ahead, exposing the center line of attack. The artillery had stopped firing smoke rounds too early. In theory, Bazarin had to guide his own battalion to the right to maintain contact with the 1st Battalion at all costs. He nuzzled his microphone closer to his lips, but he could not order Roshin into the gap. Whoever drove up between the parting curtains of smoke would be sacrificed. Bazarin glanced left to check on Dagliev, and he noticed that the ridge lines on which the smoke had settled threw a spur to the southeast. It was obvious that this would shield any attempted British counterattack. Bazarin decided to take a chance. As he spoke his first words into the microphone, British artillery fire crashed down behind his formation. The British knew. Volga 1, 2, 3, this is Ladoga 5. Amendment to combat instructions. 3, move left 600 meters. Get on the reverse slope of that spur. Use the smoke. Follow it behind the British positions. This is 3, executing now. Volga 1, 2, let's get them. Into the smoke. Independent fires on contact. 1, acknowledged. 2, acknowledged. That was Roshin. Bazarin could hear the nervousness in the boy's voice. Bazarin's tank jolted hard. Target right, 1,000, shouted the gunner. Bazarin looked right. A tank in profile, firing toward the 1st Battalion, was visible between the billows and shreds of smoke. Load Sabo, he ordered. Sabo up, fire. The tank rocked back. The round missed. The regimental net came to life.
This is Ural 5. Ambush! Ambush! They're all around me!
The 1st Battalion was in trouble. Bazarin half listened for a response from the regiment, but none came. There was nothing to do now except fight his own fight as well as he could. Bazarin focused with all of his strength. The British tank sat perfectly on the aiming point. As he watched, it began to swing its turret around. Fire! A flame splashed off the British tank. The turret stopped turning.
This is 2. Ladoga, this is 2. I've lost 2 tanks.
Roshin, he sounded near panic. Keep moving, 2. Just keep moving.
God! Oh, God! They're killing us all!
Bazarin knew beyond any doubt that the boy had lost control. He feared Roshin's panic would spread. Roshin, if you don't get off that radio, I'll shoot you myself. Do you understand me, you cowardly piece of shit?
They're behind us! I have enemy tanks to my rear!
We're behind them, you stupid fuck. Just shoot! The driver set the tank back in motion, throwing Bazarin off balance. As soon as he recovered, he tried to piece his unit back together over the radio. Bazarin wondered if he had squandered an entire company and his best company by sending them around the spur. He tried to contact Dagliev. Volga 3, this is Ladoga 5. What is your situation?
This is 3. I'm in behind them, killing them one after another as they pull off.
The company commander reported this splendid news matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Good. Wonderful. When you're done, sweep back to the east. Close the trap completely. So, perhaps things were not so bad after all. Volga 1, this is Ladoga 5. Situation?
All right, but Roshin's gone. I saw his tank go up. Catastrophic kill.
The net was briefly silent. Then Major General Duzov came on personally, surprising Bazarin.
Ladoga, this is Nevsky 10. Do you hear me?
I hear you.
We will support you. Anti-tank helicopters are closing from the north. You roll up the British from the south. I will stay on this net. If you have any problems, call immediately.
The British were in a trap. Bazarin rolled his tanks behind the last line of enemy positions smoothly. The last of the smoke disappeared, and Bazarin's tankers fought under blue skies. As the action died away, stray vehicles gathered around Bazarin's position. He acted quickly, organizing every tank he could locate into one compact force.
Ladoga, this is Nevsky 10. What's your situation?
We've cleared the ridge. I've combined my own battalion with the remnants of the 1st Battalion. We are prepared to act as a forward detachment. Bazarin tensed in anticipation. He wanted this mission. He had tasted blood, and he liked it. His battalion had earned the right to be the first to reach the Weser River.
This is Nevsky 10. Do you have a clear understanding of the mission? Just answer yes or no.
Yes, I understand. We're ready.
Good. Get your vehicles on the road, and whatever you do, keep moving. We will all be behind you.
Bazarin knew that the stray vehicles had not been sufficiently integrated, but he also knew that now, with a great hole punched through the last line of the enemy's defense, time was the dominant factor. He worked his radio in a fierce voice which had matured in the space of a morning. Major Bazarin wanted to move. The morning mist floated up off the river, blending with the smoke from the burning buildings. Gordonov had expected an assault at first light, but the only sign of hostility was the occasional rattle of a spooked rifleman. Gordonov could not understand the delay. He sat down on the edge of a table, taking the weight off his hurt leg, and slowly worked out a coded message to send back to headquarters.
Bridges secured. 45% strength.
Holding. He heard the first sudden ripple of organized fire. The initial assault was coming against Levin's side. Gordonov had not expected that. He wondered how the rest of the war was going. Where was the Soviet armor? How long would it take to arrive? He ducked back inside the communications station. Picking up a field telephone, he rang the circuit. He told everyone to get off but Levin.
Can you assess your situation yet?
The enemy is at the outpost line, said Levin. They'll be down here as soon as they realize how little we have out front. Another station cut into the line.
Command, this is Outpost 4. There are vehicles moving at the base of the hill.
Outpost 4 lay on Gordonov's side of the river. The enemy would be coming from both sides. Before Gordonov could respond, artillery rounds began to strike close by, shaking the building and shattering glass. The bastards had an observer in the town. It was the only possible explanation. Still, this was their own town. These were their people.
The bridges,
Gordonov thought.
They must need them very badly.
He helped his men hastily gather up electronics. He led them southward, dodging shell fire to the German post office building.
Set up your equipment in there. Report to Captain Karchenko if you find him, and try to get wired in again.
Gordonov left them and worked his way up behind Lieutenant Svirkin's platoon. The lieutenant had a field phone that was still operational, and Gordonov called Levin. A soldier answered. The comrade captain was up forward in the fighting, but he had sent back a message. The attackers on the eastern bank were British regulars.
You must hold, Gordonov told Svirkin. There is no alternative. Our tanks are on the way.
Gordonov scurried to check the next platoon's defenses. Firing erupted ahead of him. The lead enemy tank had already reached the position. Gordonov watched in horror as the enormous vehicle rolled toward the bridge, spraying machine gun fire to its flanks. A second tank followed the first monster. Gordonov raged at the thought of the bridge falling back into enemy hands so easily. He cut back to Svirkin.
Where's the nearest anti-tank grenadier?
Svirkin thought for a moment, then led Gordonov down the street to a soldier with an anti-tank grenade launcher. Gordonov rushed the grenadier and the lieutenant down behind the post office. They're up around the next corner. The whirring and grinding of tanks as they worked through the wreckage in the streets was unmistakable. Quick explosions, followed by bursts of Soviet fire, signaled that somebody else was fighting back.
You,
Gordonov singled out the grenadier.
Come with me. Svirkin, stay here and make damn sure we don't get cut off.
Gordonov expected to get shots into the rear of the tanks, but as soon as he and the grenadier reached the target intersection, a third tank appeared, bringing up the rear.
Shoot that one. Get the bastard.
The grenadier knelt down. He balanced his weapon on his shoulder and fired, but the tank kept coming, firing its machine guns. The grenadier collapsed. Gordonov scrambled for cover. As the tank rumbled past him, it concentrated its fire down the side street. Gordonov dashed for the grenade launcher. He ripped at the dead boy's ammunition pack, slung it over one shoulder, and ran for cover again. The rear of the tank, which had killed the grenadier, was completely exposed now. Gordonov aimed for the back of the engine compartment and fired. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke rising from its rear deck. The middle tank in the column continued to fire wildly. Gordonov closed in to where he could get a clear shot. They had tried to take his bridge, but it was not going to be that easy. He positioned himself behind the vehicle he had just killed, angling the grenade launcher for another shot. Gordonov tightened his finger on the trigger. A surviving crewman from the wrecked tank shot him in the back with a pistol. A blackened man with no forearms walked straight toward Guards Colonel Malinsky. The front commander's son instinctively backed against his command car. Anton looked about helplessly. He sensed that he should be giving orders, dramatically organizing the disaster and alleviating its effects. But it was simply too big, and there was no one to turn to. Fools had done it, Anton told himself. Unpardonable fools. A fresh fuel explosion stirred the air. Anton hunched behind the flank of his vehicle. He understood that he had just lost an entire battalion that had yet to see combat. Gone in moments. He felt pressure in his intestines again. He fought the need to go off into the smoldering woods. How, Anton asked himself, could anyone have expected to hide such an enormous organization during a hasty daylight march when it was known that the enemy had sophisticated means of reconnaissance? How could his father have permitted such a thing to happen? No, this was not his father's doing. This was the work of staff officers and commanders intoxicated by the confusion and pace of the operation. It was, finally, his own work. Anton had been well over a kilometer away from the target area when sudden blast waves seemed to lift his light vehicle up off the roadway. Anton felt absolutely powerless. He knew he had to take actions to protect his remaining march units, but in his soul he expected that somehow, after this, sensible men would agree to call it off. How could such things be allowed to continue? Anton felt his lower belly quaking. An unbearable cramp struck him, and he no longer had the control to await his subordinate's report. "Get them moving," Anton shouted. "Get the bastards moving!" The operations officer did not reply except to salute and turned to his mission. Anton rushed dizzily toward the blackened no-man's land, clutching his map case, thrusting his hand inside to seek notepaper, anything with which he might cleanse himself. He felt as though he was exploding with filth. Shilko was drinking a cup of tea when disaster struck. Enemy rounds landed on top of one of his gun platoons with artistic precision. Shilko hurried down to the battery position, outraged that anyone could have hurt his boys and his guns. The gun platoon was finished. The last of the resupply trucks had been caught as they were about to depart. The support soldiers had lingered to watch the big guns at work, and now a soldier's corpse waved limp paws down at Shilko from the branches of a tree. Other corpses smoldered with tiny patches of fire. The platoon commander lay open-eyed on his back, gasping. A medical orderly leaned over him. "Damn it," Shilko shouted. "He can't breathe. You've got to open his trachea." The orderly drew a medical knife from his kit. He punched the blade into the lieutenant's neck. Blood poured out. The orderly gripped at the lieutenant's neck, trying to hold it still, but the windpipe jerked out of the way as he stabbed a second time. The lieutenant rasped at the sky, eyes huge. He was trying to scream. Shilko smashed the orderly aside. He knelt down in the mud and placed his left hand firmly on the boy's scalp. He desperately wanted to rescue the boy, but he had no idea of where to touch or how. The lieutenant was crying. "It's all right," Shilko said. "It's all right, son." And he kept on repeating it until the last bit of life went out of the boy, his eyes fixed upon the fresh blue sky. Levin stared at his own death. The soldiers attempted to explain what had happened. A few of the prisoners of war had tried to rush the two tired guards. The guards cut them down and then continued to fire into the dungeon-like basement room, their nerves blooming into madness until each of the prisoners was dead. Levin could not believe that such a thing had happened under his command. He simply walked through the carnage in a daze. He realized that if relief forces did not break through soon, he would die. If he were captured, the British or Germans would hold him personally responsible for this butchery, and they would kill him. Levin left the old town hall. Foreign voices startled him. He drew back into a blown doorway. Off to the side, he heard firing. The enemy had gotten through. Levin ran until he reached the broad shopping street, but it was now the scene of a wild firefight. He knew that he too should fight, but he felt that the situation was hopeless. Levin worked his way along the back alleys until he found a door that had been broken open. A cluttered passage, smelling of mildew, led to a department store. He found himself stumbling through a shadowy maze of baby clothes. Clothes the like of which his son would never have. At least, not purchased by his natural father's hand. He began to cry. The bold soldier of the night before gone, beyond recall now. Stray bullets smashed glass and punched into the wall ahead of him. He kept thinking of the tangled bodies in the town hall basement, picturing his own corpse among them. He could not steel himself to return to the fighting. As he meandered through the men's clothing department, it occurred to him that he could dress himself as a German. He set down his weapons and removed his garments. He tore open packages until he found a shirt that was the right size. He grabbed a tie. He put on the shirt and pulled the tie into a knot. Then he rooted through the racks of men's suits, settling for a gray jacket and trousers. Somewhere there had to be shoes, fine Western shoes. In his rampage, he caught an unexpected glimpse of himself in a mirror. He stopped, and he began to laugh uncontrollably. His face was blackened by the residue of battle. The fine jacket hung limply, and the trouser cuffs dragged along the floor. His dirty hands had soiled the shirt. He collapsed onto the floor in laughter that broke down into sobs. He was a fool. He looked like a fool. Levin the fool. He could never pass himself off as a German. He doubted that he could pass as a human being anymore. He crawled back to his abandoned uniform and reached for his holster. He thought of the men murdered in the basement. He sensed them in the shadows, behind the piles of sweaters and socks. He thought helplessly of his son and his faithless wife. He cocked the pistol and closed his eyes. The metal tasted foul on his tongue. It was a relief to pull the trigger. The radio reports had not prepared Bizarin for the scene in the valley below. From horizon to horizon, civilian vehicles packed the highway, all fleeing the city of Hanover, trying to get across the Weser, hopefully to safety. Bizarin gave the order to move out. He had imagined that, once in the enemy's rear, the roads would be clear. Now he had to work around this exodus. He found himself thinking of Anna. She scolded him, flashing her high Polish temper, demanding that he see the mass of frightened humanity as terrified individuals seeking safety. All the same, The refugees were an annoyance. Bezarin cursed. An enemy force had just reached the opposite side of the valley, and they had come for a fight. On his right, Bezarin saw one of his tanks erupt. Another began to burn. The enemy was trying to rescue the refugees. Bezarin got on the mic.
All tanks and fighting vehicles, move forward now. Full combat speed. Get in among the refugee traffic. Fire smoke grenades and move now!
Bezarin's own vehicle lurched forward. He triggered the reloaded smoke canisters and drove headlong into the rising puffs. Beyond the thin screen of smoke, the column of automobiles blocked the enemy's field of fire. Armored infantry fighting vehicles nosed in among the tanks, losing drill formation in the headlong dash for the highway. The refugees scrambled toward their own forces, but the tables had turned. The enemy tanks had lost the race to the road and stood in the open fields.
Get them!
Bezarin screamed into the mic.
Get them while they're out in the open! Platoon commanders, direct fire!
Bezarin had not paused to consider his choice of words. His tanks engaged an enemy tank. Bezarin was in a killing mood. His tank rocked back, and before it settled, the enemy tank dazzled with sparks. A moment later, its deck blew skyward. Bezarin scanned the fields for another target. Most of the civilians had dropped into the high grass, caught in the middle of the battle. The surviving enemy vehicles soon pulled back into the far tree line, and Bezarin's supporting battery pounded their positions, forcing them back yet again. A lone civilian rose and ran up the hillside, only to be tossed about by a burst of automatic weapons fire. Bezarin grabbed the mic.
Cease fire! Cease fire! I will personally shoot the next man who fires on a civilian!
He opened his turret, only to be greeted by choking black smoke. Countless automobiles had caught fire. Dead civilians lay scattered about the roadway, some of them crushed. Beyond the smoke, Bezarin surprised a group of motorized rifle troopers with a girl. They had stripped off her skirt and underpants, leaving her only in a sweater, and they were teasing her, driving her screaming from one man to another. The girl shrieked in a foreign language, and one of the soldiers grabbed her sweater, tearing it as she tried to break out of the circle. Bezarin fired at the ground, very close to the girl's tormentor. All of the men turned to face him. Pigs! You shit-eating pigs, what do you think you're doing? None of the soldiers responded. Get back to your vehicles, now! The soldiers obeyed immediately. Bezarin turned to the girl. Go! Get out of here! Your people are up there! He pointed, wishing he could tell her in her own language. The girl tried to cover herself, tugging at the torn sweater. Go! Bezarin ordered. He pushed the girl toward the enemy's hill. The girl began to pick her way through the corpses as she worked her way through the field. A single shot sounded, and the girl's chest tore open. An instant later, she collapsed, disappearing into the shimmering grass. Bezarin moved along his disordered line of vehicles, shouting at officers and men to regroup their platoons. As soon as possible, he got them moving again, working around the chaos of refugees as rapidly as he could. As his war machines rumbled west, he scanned the sky, shutting out everything but the mission of reaching and crossing the river. The twilight deepened into darkness. It was time to take risks. Even if they were to court-martial him and have him shot over the refugee massacre, Bezarin had made up his mind. They would not do it before he reached the river. The objective remained the crossing site at Bad Oeynhausen. But Dagliev, with the forward security element, radioed that hard fighting continued at the site, and he could not get his armored vehicles across. The map showed a bridge at Rintelen to the south. Bezarin led his shrunken column directly for it. Immediately, everything seemed to go wrong. On the outskirts, Bezarin's tanks hit another traffic jam. He radioed Lasky, commander of the motorized rifle troops. Lasky, get those little bastards of yours out of their vehicles and get to the damn bridge before the British blow it. Bezarin led the tanks in a detour around the back of the town, looking for another way in. They moved through a residential section. The streets wound in arcs and twists. Frantic to reach the bridge, Bezarin turned his tank into a street that began to narrow dangerously. Can you make it? He asked his driver. I don't know, Comrade Commander. The tank's metal screamed along the walls in the narrow alley. In a moment, they got through. Off to the left, down a wider alley, Bezarin could see the span of an intact bridge rising against the dark sky. His tank nosed out in the open near the deck of the bridge. Its guardians were giving Lasky a tough time, but they had left the bridge itself virtually undefended. The bridge had cleared of traffic during the assault. Bezarin rode high in the turret, ready with the last few rounds in his machine gun. He looked to the rear. His second tank followed him, and a third was coming up. Suddenly, Small arms fire broke out from the far shore. Random shots pinged off Bazarin's tank. He tried again to call Lasky, but there was nothing on the airwaves. He could not delay any further. He gave the order to drive ahead at full speed. Bazarin's handful of tanks shot their way onto the high ground south of Bad Oeynhausen. With their last rounds, they destroyed every enemy vehicle on the hill. Quickly, Bazarin radioed Dalyev to tell everyone in the bridgeheads to hold their fire. Then he split his tiny force in two, leaving half to hold the high ground and taking the rest down toward the big bridge. Dalyev moved his tanks when he saw the firefight on the high ground. He awaited Bazarin just off the approach to the bridge.
Recross to the east bank, Bazarin ordered Dalyev, and block any enemy counterattacks. The bridge is everything.
Now it was a matter of waiting to see who would arrive first, an enemy counterattack or Soviet armor. Bazarin expected high drama, even a sort of siege. Reality disappointed him. More small Soviet elements filtered in, then full units arrived. Within an hour, enough combat power had crossed the Bad Oeynhausen bridge to hold it against any enemy counterattack. When Bazarin re-established radio contact with Rintelen, he learned that other Soviet units were crossing there as well. Mission accomplished.
Chibazov knocked lightly at the door to Malinsky's private office. The old man had returned exhausted from visiting the Army forward command posts, and despite the successes of the day, he had ripped through the staff, unusually biting as he demanded key pieces of information. Chibazov had been relieved when he finally managed to steer the old man off for a bit of sleep. Now, all too soon, he had to disturb him. Chibazov wondered to what extent Tremienko's death had upset Malinsky. If Staruchin was a wild bull who could break down the stoutest fences, Tremienko had been the front's cat, always able to find a quick and clever way around the most formidable obstacles. Chibazov sensed that, with Tremienko's loss, some intangible yet important balance had been upset within the front. He knocked again, and Malinsky responded. Chibazov entered the office. Malinsky looked up. The old man's face appeared ashen, almost lifeless, in the harsh pool of light near the map.
Comrade Front Commander, intelligence has informed the High Command of Forces that the American and British militaries have requested nuclear release. Apparently, there is a great deal of turmoil within the NATO alliance about granting the request. Perhaps the business with Lüneburg has had some effect.
The old man merely raised his eyebrows slightly, as at the poor taste of a cup of field tea.
Sit down, Pavel Pavlovich.
Chibazov calmly took a seat. The smoke of burned-down cigarettes hovered in the lamplight, as if the smoke of battle were drifting up from the map. Chibazov labored to control his asthma.
Look at the map, Pavel Pavlovich. Just look at it. And if they do get their nuclear release, how could they strike us now without slaughtering their own? And the best measure we can take is to proceed with the plan. Push deeper into their rear, and hostages. Give me hostages, Pavel Pavlovich.
For a moment, Chibazov could not follow the old man. The notion of hostages seemed so out of character.
What good are prisoners to us? Malinsky went on. We need to watch them, feed them, move them, even protect them, and we haven't time. Much better to have hostages. Malinsky pointed at the map. There, Hanover. The entire area still held by the Germans. That is a collection of hostages on a nuclear battlefield. Let them dare toss nuclear bombs at us. I do not want to precipitate a nuclear exchange if one can be avoided, but the enemy cannot be allowed to strike first. Meanwhile, see to it that the reconnaissance strike apparatus is reorganized to exploit nuclear targets. Employ the strictest security measures, but release the commander's reserve of missile troops. We'll see what our chief of missile troops and artillery is made of. Comrade Front Commander, I'm afraid we may all see what we're made of.
Malinsky smiled.
Personally, I do not believe that the West Germans will consent to nuclear usage on their soil. I believe we have already won, for now. The question is, how much have we won, and for how long?
Chibazov rose and moved close to the map. He circled a large area in the mountainous region south of the Ruhr.
Comrade Front Commander, Dudorov has drawn a blank here. From the Ruhr right down to the Taunus, almost to Frankfurt, we have only the sketchiest data.
Malinsky leaned slightly toward the map. The Americans, he asked. Does Dodorov believe the Americans will move north?
He believes our sister front has overcounted the U.S. Army formations currently committed. Dodorov is convinced that the Americans have been attacking our intelligence structure unilaterally, trying to blind us. He feels they are up to something big.
Does Dodorov really believe the Americans can move north fast enough to intercept us?
He believes the Americans will never allow the British to be destroyed. And the Americans aren't the fools we'd like them to be. They must see the threat to their lines of communication if we reach the west bank of the Rhine. They have to move at some point.
Malinsky pushed himself back into a more comfortable position.
Well, we can fight the Americans, too. Concentrate all available intelligence assets. Find their formations, if they're really out there. Now, how's the passage of the 49th Corps progressing?
Chibisov almost began his reply with, "Your son's corps," but caught himself. He answered crisply,
"The lead brigades of the 49th Corps are crossing the Weser at Bad Oeynhausen and Rinteln at this time. We had a splendid stroke of luck. A forward detachment trying to work its way to Bad Oeynhausen grabbed the Rinteln bridge. The trail brigades of the Corps are following on the same routes. But we need to send them combat instructions, otherwise they'll be too deeply committed to the push for the Rhine."
"Stick to the plan," said Malinsky. "We'll take the risk, but I don't want to be unpleasantly surprised by the Americans. Get the lead brigades of the 49th to the Rhine and across it. Direct the trail elements to be ready to assume a hasty defense. Speed them up. Get them all through the Teutoburg forest tonight."
"We can expect to fight for the passes in the Teutoburg," said Chibisov. "It's the last practical line of defense."
Malinsky waved the problem away.
"That's purely tactical. The enemy is beaten. They have too little left to stop us. Our commanders must not be timid."
Chibisov thought again of Malinsky's son. Guards Colonel Anton Malinsky had a reputation as a painstaking officer, but a loner. Now the son would have a chance to perform on his own, perhaps against the Americans with their magnificent weapons. Chibisov wished the son luck, for the father's sake. Suddenly, Malinsky turned from the map, smiling. "We'll beat them, Pavel Pavlovich, and we can beat the Americans, too." Operations maps decorated the wall of the German living room. Battery-powered lamps shone their harsh light across the room as Anton moved from officer to officer, checking, correcting, struggling to remain lucid despite his rising fever. At midnight, he had led his wounded brigade across the big bridge at Bad Oeynhausen. He had dismounted to empty his sick bowels yet again. The bridgehead had been in a chaotic state. There were indications of a possible counterattack by U.S. Army forces coming up from the south. Anton had to prepare his force for a turn to the south beyond the Teutoburg forest. If the Americans did appear, it was imperative to hold them there. Sickness clouded his mind as the Corps commander briefed him.
"The front is making every effort to locate the American grouping, if such a force is actually out there. But I don't think there will be a problem before daylight, at the earliest. The Americans couldn't move that fast. In the meantime, go like the wind."
Anton braced himself. He told himself that his diarrhea was slackening off now, although he knew he was running a high fever. How would it do, he asked himself, for the son of General Malinsky, the privileged son of the great Malinsky, to miss the war because he had a case of the shits? But the sarcasm did not work, and Anton knew that he would keep on going until his body quit on him, paying the price of his father's terrible love. As the hasty briefing session came to a close, Anton slipped away to the toilet, lighting his way with a pocket lamp. The house was gorgeously furnished, the sort of house he wished he could provide for Zina. Fine, dark, polished wood and brass. There was a baby grand in one of the rooms. At any other time he would have paused to bring its keys to life, but his cramping bowels made him hurry on. Crouching alone in the dark, Anton thought of his father again. The old man was beating them all. Anton felt gladness, but no pride. It was so thoroughly his father's triumph. General Malinsky's private pilot flew him toward Hanover. The night flight took them through corridors of fire where towns and cities burned like enormous lamps in the dark.
Hanover coming up on the right,
the pilot declared. As the city drifted by, Malinsky examined his handiwork. Not all of Hanover had burned, and he regretted that any of it was ablaze, but you could not make war neatly. He had talked with Starukhin prior to lifting off, bringing him up to date on the developing situation. Dudorov had been right. The Americans were coming, but the river line was open now. Despite the desperation of NATO's air attacks, the 49th Corps had crossed 3 of its 4 maneuver brigades, and Starukhin's divisions were ready to follow in force. But the business with the Americans gnawed at Malinsky. The battlefield, for all the front's fine successes, had become a fragile thing. The front had moved so far, so fast, and had suffered such losses that the units and formations were disorganized. There was a lack of control out there that Malinsky could sense through the darkness. It was a battlefield on the edge of anarchy. If it materialized, the American attack would need to be dealt with swiftly and violently before it could discover and exploit the front's weaknesses. And if the Americans did attack in the Paderborn direction, the 49th would have the mission of stopping them. His son's brigade would be directly in the line of attack. Malinsky recognized the danger, but such were the fortunes of war, and his son would fight well, he had no doubt. The helicopter started losing altitude. Malinsky was anxious to get out and hear the latest from Starukhin. And, he admitted to himself in a moment of weakness, he desperately wanted to know what was happening to his son's brigade. Major Barach enjoyed the clean feel of the night air as his tank cruised down the mountain. He had worried when the column first approached the Teutoburg forest. It was inconceivable that such a perfect choke point would go undefended. But no one had fired a shot. If the Americans showed up, they would beat the devil out of them. And if they failed to appear, Barach intended to see the Rhine before sunset. Barach enjoyed leading the way, despite the obvious risk. He worried about the brigade commander. Colonel Malinsky had been visibly ill at the hurried meeting a few hours before. Distant points of light on the southern horizon caught Barach's eye. Without further warning, Barach's vehicles began to erupt. Barach dropped into his turret. He broke open the radio net.
Air Defense Commander, this is the battalion commander. Do you hear me? This is the Air Defense Commander. Enemy helicopters. Why aren't you firing? What good are you? We are firing. The targets are out of range. We can't even pick them up on radar.
Barach tried to understand, but how could the enemy be out of range or invisible? What were the air defense troops for, after all? He switched over to the long-range radio, calling brigade headquarters. The airwaves buzzed with static. The enemy was jamming everything. Barach popped open his hatch to visually inspect the situation. The sight of his battalion shocked him. Dozens of vehicles stood ablaze. There were more fires than he could count, stretching down the road as far as he could see. Barach struggled to master himself, to take some effective action. A noise, enormous beyond imagination, stopped him. The brigade's senior officer of transport troops watched helplessly as his supply column began to explode. Enemy tanks, sleek, with flat, angular turrets, emerged from the murk across the valley. Bristling into small unit formations, they used their main armaments sparingly, raking the trucks with machine gun fire. A motorized rifle unit tried to deploy and returned the fire. The transport officer watched with a surge of hope, but the tanks kept coming. The tanks opened up with their main guns against the Guardian combat vehicles, destroying each with the first shot. The transport officer ordered his assistant and driver to take cover in the trees where he joined them. At an unheard signal, the tanks opened volley fire on the precious transports. The transport officer's abandoned vehicle lifted off the ground on a cushion of flames. The driver, lying nearby in the brush, screamed in pain, caught by a fragment of steel. The enemy tanks swept up over the hill, passing within 100 meters of the transport officer's hiding place. Phantom-like, they disappeared into the darkness, headed north. The transport officer knew that they were not supposed to be this far north, that this was critical information, but his vehicle, with its radio, was a smoldering pile of junk. After the whine of the engine subsided, he ordered his assistant to see to the wounded driver. Then he started down into the burning valley. The enemy had passed,
but it sounded like a great battle was still raging as stores of ammunition exploded. A radio, he thought. If only they'd left me a radio. Anton felt the situation collapsing around him with irresistible speed. The Americans had hit him broadside hours before they were expected to appear. Feverish, he stared at the map, trying to make some sense of the situation. His brigade was dissolving. "Comrade Brigade Commander," his chief of staff called, "can you please listen to me?" Anton turned slightly. He had not even been aware of the man a moment before. He felt disgracefully weak. He drew himself up before the map and the eyes of his staff, unsure of how much longer he would be able to remain on his feet. "Look," the chief of staff said. "The brigade transport officer reports enemy tanks here working their way north beyond Lemko." "That's impossible. That would put them behind us." "Yes, Comrade Commander. The transport officer swears he saw them with his own eyes." This cannot be happening, Anton thought. He laid his hand on the map, bracing himself, but attempting to disguise the action as a gesture of decisiveness. "Order all units to halt where they are and assume a hasty defense. All units this time. I want every major intersection blocked and covered with fire." He felt nauseous, dizzy. He had to sit down. "Hold on," Anton told himself. "Just hold on. It can't last forever." Starukhin's quartering party had selected a fine site for the command post, tucked into a row of West German warehouses, spacious enough to hold all the command and support vehicles. The 3rd Shock Army commander dispatched a nervous staff colonel on a mission. Then he turned to Malinsky. Starukhin came up so close that Malinsky could smell the big man's stale sweat. "Comrade Front Commander, the situation along your son's route of march has become critical." "You mean the situation along the route of the 3rd Brigade of the 49th Corps," Malinsky corrected, struggling to control his facial muscles. Yes, the 3rd Brigade. It's very bad, Comrade Front Commander." Anton. Malinsky knew it was not right to think of the boy now. He risked losing all perspective. Yet he ached to see his son, and, he realized helplessly, he wanted to protect him. But Anton was a soldier, a guards colonel in the Malinsky tradition, in the Russian tradition. He would have to do his duty. Anton. "What does the Corps commander have to say, Starukhin? Doesn't Zev believe he can master the situation?" "Comrade Front Commander, we have temporarily lost communications with the Corps-level command posts. We can talk to your sons. I mean, the 3rd Brigade, however." Malinsky pondered the situation for a moment, then reached for a cigarette. Calmly, he told himself, do it calmly. Do not let him see a trace of emotion. "And your situation, Starukhin? Tell me about the 3rd Shock Army." "We'll manage. We'll hold them. They'll never cross the Weser River line." A staff officer approached the two generals. He looked back and forth between them. "Well," said Starukhin. "Comrade commanders, the 3rd Brigade of the 49th Corps is being overrun." The tent sheltering Anton's command post shivered, shaking the maps lining the canvas walls as the enemy artillery pounded the local area. There was still no enemy contact in the immediate vicinity, but American forces had passed by on both flanks. The brigade, the entire corps, had been caught, and caught badly. It had all been too fast, and the intelligence had been too slow, and now they were paying the price. Still, Anton realized that the failure remained his own. What would his father think? A Malinsky brought low by bad digestion. It would shame the old man. He thought of Zina, of all the things he had to tell her. "Colonel Malinsky," the chief shouted, "your father is on the secure radio. Can you talk to him?" His father. Anton rose quickly, a bit too quickly, as though he had been caught committing an indiscretion, letting his father down. The chief of staff helped him across the command post to the vehicle containing the secure radio sets. The operator spoke. "Your call sign is Firebird. The front commander is Blizzard." Anton took the microphone, steeling himself. "Blizzard, this is Firebird. This is Blizzard. Report your situation. This is Firebird. We are in heavy combat. Enemy units have penetrated. Our current course of action involves establishing a series of local defenses to retain control of vital intersections to slow the enemy's attack. The voice was slow to respond. Did I make a mistake? Anton wondered. Did I do something wrong? Firebird, this is Blizzard. Your decision is approved. Continue local defensive actions. Do all you can to disrupt the enemy's plan. The voice paused, and Anton thought for a moment that the transmission had come to an end. He nearly panicked. He wanted to tell his father. He wasn't certain, but he knew there were important things to say. Then the voice came back. You must hold out. You must. We will support you. We will support you with every available attack aircraft. You may expect relief by our ground forces in 12 to 18 hours. Can you hold on? Anton straightened his back. Blizzard, this is Firebird. We will do our duty. I know you will do your duty, and you will have all the support the motherland can give you. Good luck. Anton stood still. He wanted to hear his father's voice a little longer, anything not to let go of the old man. He hurried toward the entrance flap of the canvas tent. Outside, he looked around for the guards. He did not want anyone to see him. His intestines bit him again, struggling to empty themselves. Anton staggered. Bushes caught at his trousers. Behind low shrubs, he tore at his clothing, stripping down. In his agony, he'd lowered himself against the trunk of a tree. He knew he had failed. Now his father was trying to rescue him. He had even corrupted his father. Anton stared, sweating, up through the trees. The sky was a magnificent blue. He wheezed, waiting for his body to finish punishing him. The roar of the jets came up fast. They flew very low. The jets, he thought. Already his father had sent him the gifts he'd promised. But the forest began to burn around him. He was on his side, lying in dampness. A blast slapped him against a tree. He crumpled, crying. He felt as though he were tumbling in the waves, playing with Zena. It was Cuba, and the sea was salty and warm, and the sky was a splendid, cloudless blue. And the sun came closer and closer, and he rolled in the sea. It was too rough for Zena. He called to warn her, and the enormous sun came closer still. Anton opened his eyes. Everything around him was on fire. And then he realized he was burning too. His hands were burning. The rags around his ankles were burning. He scrambled to his feet, waving the torches of his hands. Zena, Father, not like this. God, not like this. The new mission startled Bazarin. He had expected to be withdrawn to an area where his scattered unit could be reassembled and rearmed. But his new orders were to defend the bridgehead against an armored assault. Bazarin roused his men. He believed that with ammunition and a bit more fuel, his unit could give a good account of itself. But it seemed absurd to expect his tiny force to hold back some threat capable of overwhelming the new Soviet tanks that had passed in such great numbers to the west. Probably, Bazarin figured, the orders simply reflect caution, a systematic response to an enemy counterattack. He set his face into his "I'm in command here" expression and marched down among his vehicles. He felt a profound surge of pride in his dirty, knocked-about tanks and in the new brotherhood of men who crewed them. Come what may, they would do their duty. Still, Bazarin considered, it would have been nice to have a bit of ammunition. Shilko felt as though he had stumbled into a cache of hidden treasures. Splendid farm instruments crowded the barn, and this wonderful assortment of devices for bringing life out of the earth apparently belonged to one private farmer here in West Germany. It did not seem fair. Shilko sat down on a bale of hay. He rarely wandered off by himself, but now, west of the Weser River, perhaps a day from the fabled Rhine, riding the currents of victory, he sought a few moments of solitude.
Sitting in the rich twilight of the barn, with brilliant rays of light slicing the amber gloom, he tried to sort things out. Men were dying by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, but only the pathetic death of his lieutenant had made it real for him. Shilko rose and returned to his place of duty. The control post erected in the farm courtyard boiled with activity. The senior duty sergeant brought Shilko his tea. Romulinsky worked at the situation map with the care of a surgeon. "Any change?" asked Shilko. The captain shook his head. "What about the progress of the Americans?" "It sounds like a mess down south, but right now I'm more worried about the Germans. We seem to have Dutch units counterattacking. Everybody thought they were knocked out of the war." "They're fighting for their homes. It must be a terrible thing to be on the other side just now." Romulinsky looked at Shilko in surprise, then ignored his commander's musings. "All of our own elements are in position, Comrade Commander. There's still no resupply of ammunition, but we have enough rounds left to make it hot for somebody, and we're in position to sweep the main arteries with direct fire. Hopefully we'll have a bit of warning." "Just be ready, Romulinsky. I want everyone in a fighting position. Every last cook. We've come too far to throw away success." Romulinsky moved sharply to act on the order. Shilko listened intently to the hammering in the distance. He put down his cup of tea and stepped outside to hear more clearly. The noise level had lessened significantly. Even as he listened, it seemed as though the sounds of battle diminished still further. His pulse quickened. Perhaps the counterattack had been defeated. The sounds of the guns stopped completely. Romulinsky, visibly excited, hurried out from under the canvas of the control post. Comrade Commander! Comrade Commander! The West Germans have requested a ceasefire!" Chibizov emerged from the bunker in the light of day. The sight of the splintered forest shocked him. The acridity of explosives lingered in the air. Yet even this pungent air tasted gorgeously fresh after the bunker. Aircraft still cut the heavens. Traffic continued on the roads, but the sounds of combat had stopped. In the end, Stein, with his little movies, had been right, as had Dudaroff. The Germans had caved in. The West German government had declared a unilateral ceasefire. All NATO combat forces were to withdraw west of the Rhine within 96 hours and to leave German soil entirely within 15 days. And, as the NATO armies withdrew, Soviet tanks closed in on the Rhine without firing a shot. There were rumors that the Americans did not regard the war as finished and were preparing to strike elsewhere. Personally, Chibizov hoped it was over. A blackbird settled down into a splintered tree, and Chibizov thought of Malinsky's son. Guards Colonel Malinsky had been reported killed by an airstrike, but the body had not been recovered, and the old man refused to accept his son's death. The general had gone forward in person to conduct the search. Chibizov felt deeply sorry for his protector and comrade. He realized helplessly how much he loved the old man. How much better if an asthmatic renegade Jew who could not find a home in any camp had died in place of the cherished son. Of course, it did no good to romanticize death. Chibizov looked up at the crow on the broken limb. The bird spread its wings and rose skyward. Chibizov took a deep breath, filling his withered lungs, and he turned back to the bunker to sort out combat statistics. "We were entirely cut off," Seriosha told the soldiers gathered around his bunk. "Completely surrounded. Enemy tanks everywhere. You can't imagine it. But we held out for 2 days, and we killed every German soldier who came near us." Leonid accepted the tale. Seriosha had told it so many times that it had acquired a truth of its own. He and Seriosha never exchanged a word about the incident in the basement in the little German town. And, really, there was nothing to say that could change anything. They had simply hidden in a barn until Soviet forces returned. The unit was fresh and had not seen combat. Leonid and Seriosha were sent to a holding facility for soldiers. They were quartered in a large barracks near the town of Bergen. Leonid did not mind the arrangement at all. Sooner or later they would all be discharged, and he would go home and play his guitar. As Seriosha finished his story, a voice loudly called the barracks to attention. The warrant officer in charge of work details appeared beside a new captain. He announced that a very sensitive mission, one of great honor, required a platoon of soldiers for its immediate execution. They were all familiar with this particular litany. It meant that more bodies had been located. It was the worst detail imaginable. Leonid knew he would be selected. It was just his luck. Bezarin sat on a concrete slab at the water's edge, watching the last American forces withdraw from the Rhine. He wore his new medal and a fresh uniform. General Malinsky, the front commander, had presented several dozen awards at a gathering hosted by General Starukhin, commander of the 3rd Shock Army. The banquet undoubtedly continued with passionate drinking, but Bezarin had no thirst for alcohol at the moment, and he slipped away to think about Anna and the rest of his life. Between daydreams, he watched the Americans passing in the distance. Venomous-looking attack helicopters covered the crossing from mid-river and from the industrial tangle of the far bank. Tanks crossed the big bridge with their main guns at the ready. The Americans did not look like a beaten army, but they had been beaten, if not on the field of battle, then at the greater level of political decision. Bezarin remembered waiting on the heights at Bad Oeynhausen, surrounded by his surviving tanks, out of ammunition, as the American spearheads slashed up through the forwardmost Soviet formations. Bezarin figured he could beat his opponents, but he had not wanted to face them without any main gun ammunition. The Americans, the great enemy. Now they were leaving, and it seemed as if a lifelong nightmare had finally ended. He had attempted to report honestly on the tragedy that had occurred along the highway, but no one wanted to hear it. The Soviet Union needed war heroes, not war criminals. And Bezarin became a hero, one of the brilliant heroes of the Weser Crossing operation. In his own mind, the horror of the massacre had already begun to recede in importance. He tried to write Anna about the tragedy, expecting that she would somehow understand and help him, but he could not put the words to paper. The incident seemed to demand forgetting, to be buried, like the dead themselves. Bezarin knew that certain images would remain with him, but now he spent more time thinking of Anna, remembering the fragrance of the spring and the warm feel of the woman he had held in his arms. Instead of writing his confession to her, he had found the strength, at last, to write and say he loved her. A vehicle pulled in up on the quay. Bezarin stood up. He was not supposed to be off on his own. There were reports of violent assaults against Soviet officers and men throughout the occupation zone. Startled, Bezarin's hand swung to his holster. The sight of the major surprised Malinsky. He had neither wanted nor expected company. He simply wanted to see the Rhine up close, to savor his moment in history as best he could, to confirm the value of his sacrifice. Now here is a nervous major reaching for his pistol. "I would be grateful, Comrade Major, if you didn't shoot me." The major reddened, stammering out a barely intelligible apology. "Don't worry, don't worry. It's always a good thing to be on your guard." He recognized the major as one of the men on whom he'd pinned a medal not an hour before, and he offered him a cigarette, which the major clumsily declined. It struck Malinsky as odd to find this fresh-baked hero alone when Starukhin was holding court for all of his heroes at what promised to be one of the greatest parties of the century. Well, who knew what devils chewed at this lone major? The war had different effects on different men. Malinsky examined the younger man. The major's face was bright enough, not as intelligent and certainly not as sensitive as Anton's face had been, but it was the type of clean, earnest face that would go far under the new regime. "Married, Comrade Major? Thinking of your wife and family, perhaps?" "No, Comrade Front Commander, I'm not married." Malinsky flicked his cigarette ashes toward the river. "A girl, then?" "Yes, Comrade Front Commander, a wonderful girl, very well educated." "Well, you must marry her. Marriage is a wonderful institution. I highly recommend it, and you must have children. The motherland needs to preserve the bloodlines of her heroes." Malinsky suddenly wanted to end the discussion. He thought of his wife. He would not see her for some time yet, and she would have to bear the news of Anton's fate alone. Anton's wife, too, was alone, more alone than his own life. No one would ever come back to the girl. Malinsky thought of Zina, a silly, irresponsible, red-haired girl, impossible to dislike, swollen with the energy of life, bursting with it. She had possessed none of the makings of a soldier's wife except the ability to love his son. And that love had made his son so happy that Malinsky found it easy to indulge the girl's artistic pretensions. Yes, he thought, she made my son happy. I must take care of her now. Malinsky felt tears rising, and such a display would never do. He fought for and regained control of himself. But he could not reconcile himself to Anton's death. He could not bear it. He looked at the major, who had averted his eyes. Why should this man live instead of my own son? Why, of all the sons, did Anton have to die? Malinsky understood war. He even understood the minuscule importance of his son's fate in the shadow of events that changed the world. But he could not, would not, reconcile himself to it. He raged at the death, holding Anton alive in his heart. The last of the Malinskys, he thought bitterly. Anton. Malinsky followed the major's gaze out over the polluted water to the commanding span of the bridge. The Americans were going. Malinsky knew how close they had come to embarrassing his plan. They had almost beaten him. But almost was a word that carried no reward. It was time to go. Malinsky had other ceremonies to attend, other medals to award. He felt an urge to salute the Americans before he left, the tribute of an old soldier, but he doubted the major would understand the gesture. The old traditions were dying, and you could not keep them alive artificially, no matter how hard you tried. A new and thoughtless age had overtaken them. In the end, Malinsky simply wished the major luck with his girl.
Red Army was written by Ralph Peters and read by David Ogden Stiers.